Hello, and welcome back to day 2 of the EUNIC Digital Experience Artificial Intelligence Conference. We're your hosts, Caroline Busta.
And Julian Wadsworth from New Models in Berlin. For those who tuned in now who may be new to what this is and the institution's work, EUNIC is the European Union National Institutes for Culture, the network of organizations from national cultural institutes to ministries of foreign affairs, engaging in cultural relations across the EU to strengthen dialogue, cultural cooperation, and diversity.
In today's earlier session, we focused on the geopolitical implications of artificial intelligence, with reports from and discussions with 4 European experts working in the fields of digital ethics, security, and tech diplomacy: Catherine Jarmol, Gry Hasselbach, Karen Young, and Martin Rauchbauer.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We were also able to define some terms and dispel some myths around artificial intelligence, but we also mapped out the criticisms, challenges, and near philosophical questions that remain in flux within the fields of machine learning and AI. While the effects of these technologies will be global, their origins disproportionately radiate from a few key regions.
Not least among these, of course, is Silicon Valley, or Silicon Valley in its post COVID geographically expanded scope in Reno and other places farther afield. So, for this reason, in any case, so for this session, we are sending the signal back over to the West Coast of America server farms to learn the grid, a unique pilot project created in cooperation with the European Commission and the European External Action Service that proposes a new model of international collaboration where a European cultural presence and host region partners act together within a common cultural space.
The grid is also supported by a global partnership with Salesforce, perhaps the biggest tech company that many haven't heard of. It operates in the business to business sector from Salesforce Tower, the tallest building in San Francisco. So, business owners or anyone who looks up in that city probably are very familiar. As I'm sure you'll hear in the following program, this kind of public-private partnership is important in many ways, not the least of which is bringing the likes of artists and ethicists into the R&D process so that they can participate in the development of processes they otherwise would just be responding to.
It also gives the countries of the European Union a more active and influential presence in the world center of disruptive technologies, better positioning us all for collaboration, action, and reaction. We are now going to pass along the mic from Berlin, where our day is coming to a close, to San Francisco, where the day is just beginning. So please welcome the president of EUNIC Silicon Valley, Clara Bloom, and Austrian tech ambassador to Silicon Valley, who we spoke with this morning, his very early morning, Martin Rauchbauer, who will tell you much more about their initiative, Get on the Grid. So welcome, Clara and Martin, and the digital stage is now yours.
Thank you so much, Caroline and Julian. That was an incredible introduction. Very, very astute observations there. Thank you. Hello from San Francisco. So this is Clara Bloom and Martin Rauchbauer. I'm the head of the Art and Tech Lab at Open Austria and also currently the president of our local cluster here, EUNIC Silicon Valley. And I'm very, very happy to moderate this 2-hour session together with my dear colleague and co-conspirator, Martin Rauchbauer, Austrian Tech Ambassador here to Silicon Valley.
Yes, it's a very early morning here in San Francisco, so good evening to Europe.
All right, we'll introduce to you our European initiative here in Silicon Valley, as has already been introduced, the GRID, Connecting Art, Tech, and Policy. And for that, I will start by sharing my screen with y'all. Okay, so this is us. We decided to fill those 2 hours with 6 very brief spotlights that kind of encompass this very broad field of activities that we offer with the GRID. And we'll start by presenting some of the highlights of our first ever edition of exposure, a virtual format, a festival format that we created and launched this September in San Francisco, but basically around the world since it was entirely virtual, connecting the worlds of art, tech, and policy with a special focus on the intersection of AI and creativity, but also in dialogue with policymakers and the tech industry, our project Taming Tech. Then we'll go on to talk with our colleagues at EUNIC Silicon Valley, especially with Noémie Yangiru, director of the Goethe Institute in San Francisco. Unfortunately, Juliette Donadieu, the cultural attaché of the French Consul General in San Francisco, couldn't join us today. But then we'll talk about building digital communities, especially in times of Corona, and how this is done with Shamsha Berk, Executive Director from 01, passing on the mic to Vanessa Chang, our principal investigator at The Grid. And we'll talk about this new report that she's been drafting over the last 6 months or so, the Art and Tech Report 2020. And then the last hour we'll spend on a more philosophical note. First of all, we'll talk with Tobias Rees, the director of the Berggruen Institute, and Patrick Hebron from Adobe, about connecting the worlds of art, tech, and policy, not just through collaborations and artistic projects, but also more on a more philosophical note, creating a common language, a universal language, so to speak, to create a common understanding of this digital reality. And lastly, we'll wrap up our session with Brian Mccann, co-founder and CTO of Stealth AI startup, who talks about a pioneering project with Daniel Kehlmann, a German-Austrian author, on AI and art collaborations. So also very important, if you see or hear anything you like, make sure to get on the grid. Contact us directly at contact@getonthegrid.org and check out our website, getonthegrid.org. Also, I should tell you that we have a chat function. With that, you can talk to us, and with the Q&A section, ask us something. We're here to answer all of your questions. And I'll hand over to Martin now.
Thank you, Clara. So we created the grid in 2019 together with our European colleagues at EUNIC Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was selected out of 44 applications worldwide for the European Spaces of Culture project, and is now being supported by EUNIC Global, by the European Union, as well as the private sector in Silicon Valley. But what is the grid? We're a network, a facilitator, a content curator, a festival, a matchmaker, and of course a mover and shaker here in Silicon Valley, and we hope as well with our European partners. But let us show you a short video which captures very well our motivation, our vision as well behind this global initiative.
Technology flings us into the future, towards efficiency and productivity and speed. What do these achievements give us, and what do they strip away? In art, we create our most profound aspirations. We recognize who we are and imagine who we must become. Both art and technology show us our horizons and seek to transcend these limits. Our world teeters on the brink of collapse. To meet this challenge, artists and technologists must come together to imagine, to make, to create. The grid connects these two worlds by fusing their strengths, because art powers technology.
So art powers technology. That's the conviction we share with our many partners. And that conviction propels us to believe that the grid can work not only in Silicon Valley, but elsewhere as well around the globe. In Silicon Valley, however, it has a special ring. We are here in the world's largest innovation ecosystem. Many of the tech companies that have shaped our presence and maybe also our future have their origin in Silicon Valley, as well as their technologies. The big internet platforms such as Google, Facebook, Twitter have their business models based on, as we learned this morning, machine learning and artificial intelligence, and the massive extraction of consumer data having a huge influence on our contemporary culture. They've also raised quite a bit of concerns and anxieties in our societies across the globe about the loss of our privacy, disinformation, addiction to social media, and the polarization of our societies.
Yeah, and with that, we'd like to shed a light on our first spotlight, our little festival. Well, this happened in September. It was 4 days of 26 events, full of art, panels, workshops, interactive experiences, performances. We had over 100 speakers and artists from 12 different countries. I dare say quite an accomplishment given the circumstances, because clearly the grid presents a new way for Europe to engage with Silicon Valley as through the arts. And that has been quite the success formula for us. Our initiative connects art institutes, artists, and artistic thinking wherever it happens, with creative technologists and innovators that think of global solutions to our global problems, but it also has a local connotation to it. All of this is happening clearly also physically in Silicon Valley. But what happens when we can't gather physically? And that was the hurdle that we had to overcome this year, because all of our plans and ambitious projects just simply evaporated in the course of several hours, basically. And so since Corona proved quite a challenge for all cultural facilitators around the world, and especially for cultural relations, with the grid, we thought we can't just roll over and play dead. We have to step up our game. This is the moment. This is the moment for art. This is the moment where we need to show our true colors. And since we believe that art is especially essential in times of crisis, we did so with exposure. Also need to say that with this festival, we introduced a third silo into our little circle of stakeholders, and those are policymakers. And we initiated a discussion with policymakers from Europe and California to start thinking about pioneering ways how we could shape technology for to better suit our human needs as individuals, but also as societies. And since these are 26 events, we'll give you a short trailer of our activities so you can have a notion of what happened. And then please just check out whatever panel you think suits your interest on our YouTube channel. All the content is free, clearly, so go ahead. Here we go. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention. Clearly, this was a megalomaniac project involving 16 partner organizations, but we put a special focus on 4 cultural organizations in the Bay Area, the Gray Area, Kodame, Mutex San Francisco, and 01, which is a local partner that we've invited for a conversation later here. We also did a lots of partnership program with the Center for Humane Technology that has now been prominently featured with The Social Dilemma on Netflix. Check it out. Our colleagues at the European Union delegation of the US, clearly also Salesforce, which has already been mentioned, the STARTS program by the European Commission, the Ars Electronica, and the European Commission itself. So here comes our trailer. Welcome to the Grid Exposure Art, Tech, and Policy Days.
Hello, everyone.
And welcome.
Hi, everybody.
Good morning. Welcome, everybody.
We have to probably revisit what it means to be creative, because if a machine generates something not to make a human feel great, but to make another machine feel great, is that still art or music?
To equip ourselves with loads of research and knowledge because there's going to be a lot of naysayers against UBI.
Artists with catalytic thinking can really push industry toward different, as you say, disruptive, I guess, solutions that they hadn't thought of and are uncomfortable with.
You go into this very uncanny valley where it sounds like a saxophone, but it's not really quite a saxophone.
So it's a very intimate form of AI, which is not something that most people experience. Right? Usually when we think about AI, we're thinking about this domineering corporate structure or something that's like doing things to us instead of this internal intimate tool.
So we have machine listening, and we have a saxophonist who does what great musicians always do, which is include the body and the feedback mechanisms of the response of the computer to help the machine do better.
We need fundamentally new kinds of human rights because our technology has a new sort of cognitive dominance that can like override ours.
We do actually want to go into a process of mutual listening and learning and into a spirit of dialogue, and then come up together with activities and initiatives that make sense in a certain environment and context. And I think this is why we can have projects like the Grid.
I absolutely have to become a more artistically creative policymaker. I frankly had never considered that before, but I can certainly see how those worlds do intersect.
You know, a human being apparently now cannot defeat a computer in chess, right? But no computer can beat a machine and a human being playing together as a team, right?
Most students in my lab have started calling it the golden ratio of patriarchy, because that number keeps coming up over and over again.
And I think it's going to be fascinating to have that shift where we're no longer necessarily composing at the level of note by note or small idea by small idea and composing more at gestures and sort of bigger picture ideas. I think that could be really exciting.
Welcome to the Grid.
So that was a small recapture of Exposure, our festival we had in September. And now we would like to start our first spotlight, talking a little bit about this new form of cultural diplomacy, of conducting cultural relations here in the West Coast of the United States. And I would like to welcome our partner in crime here in San Francisco, the director of the Goethe Institute San Francisco, Noemi Nyangiro, who happens also to be our incoming EUNIC president in 2021. Welcome, Noemi. And I would like to start with asking you, EUNIC Silicon Valley is a relatively recent cluster of our network. We're founded just over a year ago in June 2019, but we have this specific focus on the intersection of art and technology, and specifically do not work in this European platform around traditional arts. Do you think this focus and this approach to cultural relations could or even should be implemented in other parts of the world?
Hello. First of all, thanks so much, Martin and Clara. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you for your question, Martin, because I think it's a really good one. It's one we actually considered ourselves when we were putting this cluster together and founded it. So I am, to be honest, a very strong believer of the focused approach, and for various reasons. I think it gives the EUNIC cluster an opportunity to see what is actually the potential on the ground, what are also the needs on the ground, and how can we come together and react to that. And so as much as art and tech is something that makes a lot of sense here in the Bay Area, I think there are other places in the world where it might also make sense, or a different focus. But what this focus does is that I'm pretty sure it increases the impact, and it increases the impact, for example, because it actually needs for you to dive in deeper a little bit, both in the local scene to understand and learn what is actually really needed. But it also needs a lot of communication between the EUNIC members. I think we talked a lot, we discussed a lot, because as soon as you have a focused approach, you need to start thinking, how do we reach that goal? What do we actually want to reach, and how do we measure that? And I think that's so much more worthwhile than other strategies. So, and I've seen other strategies within EUNIC cluster. So I was very happy that we do it like this and try it like this in the Bay Area.
Thank you. Yeah, we absolutely agree, clearly. That's why we work so well. I have a follow-up question for you. So our cluster is rapidly expanding, not very surprisingly, because Silicon Valley is a hotspot, right? This is a hotspot for cultural relations. We started out as a very small cluster with the Italian Cultural Institute, the Goethe Institute, the French Cultural Services, Open Austria, and later in the year also Swissnex as our associate member. We've now been joined by the Irish Consul General, the Portuguese Consul General, and the Flanders House are in the pipeline. And I think we'll just pile up new memberships that are not only intrigued by EUNIC Silicon Valley, but also by the great initiative. And so as Austrians, we're handing over the baton with 2021 to a French-German co-presidency. And we're all really curious, since there's so much potential in this particular space that we have to maneuver, so to speak. So after the groundbreaking work that we've already done as a cluster, where do you see our cluster evolving into?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, especially after this huge bang we had in this year. I think there are several things to say. So for one, the year is actually not done yet. So you've already heard about the Exposure Festival, but we have other formats as well that we develop within the EUNIC cluster. For example, Notes, Art and Tech Encounters. That's a panel series that brings together speakers from the EU and from the US to together discuss potential kinds of collaboration between art and tech, but also look into previous collaborations that were successful and to learn and see, okay, why did this work and how did it work? And you learn pretty interesting stuff, actually, if you look back a little bit before you go forward. And that's something we're trying to do there. So there is actually a session coming up this Thursday where we are going to talk about the potential of art to make technology more inclusive. There's another session coming up in December where we're going to talk about actually the GRID's report and see, okay, what are the main takeaways from this report, beautifully done by Vanessa Chang. I'm sure she'll talk about it in a bit as well. So these formats, we want to still see them through, and we might actually continue with them in the coming year. We've also been working on an evaluation, again, to see, okay, having gone through a pretty crazy year, I mean, let's face it, we had everything ready, like you said, and then everything had to be changed again within hours, basically. And it's actually not so easy to do this within the cluster, but even with our partners. And we want to learn from our partners, did this go well? Would they have liked some other strategies to come out of it with us? We believe very much in this transparency and tight and trustful dialogue. So then looking into the next year, this is now, I would say, kind of combination of continuing what we've started, what you started under your presidency, Clara and Martin, and trying to continue those strategies that worked for us, keep exploring formats, keep exploring together with our local partners, but also see, can we maybe change the focus, not of art and tech, we'll definitely stay with art and tech, but look at it from a maybe a different angle, like when it comes to social issues, like access, bias, and diversity. So that's something we want to look in the coming year. Other than that, I would say that I think a strong point to take from this year that we learned was also our ability to support in policy matters. That actually was something that came along the way, and it seemed to have a very strong impact, and that's something we want to continue. It seems to be something that we can offer to the local scenes, let's say, and to this kind of dialogue between art and tech. In general, I think everything we do at the end is going to support this translation and mitigating between artists and technologists in the long run. So we're very excited. I think we're going to keep exploring and experimenting. So stay tuned, because for sure it's going to be a year full of new formats and programming. Would be great to see you there.
Wonderful, Noemi. Maybe just in one final question, and maybe just in one sentence. We've been in this together in this experiment. In one sentence, what's your greatest learning about how to conduct cultural relations after doing this for a bit over a year through the GRID, through our EUNIC Silicon Valley cluster?
Thank you. Okay, I would say the best and strongest takeaway: be transparent, honest, and open in all your communication with the partners and among the EUNIC members, because it is a very diverse group, and we all have very unique strength and expertise, but also different networks to tap into and to increase the dialogue with. So I think that's something we've learned and that we can actually increase.
Thank you so much, Noemi. Thank you. That was short and sweet and perfect to the point. That's exactly right, what we need for our spotlights. And we're so thrilled. Looking forward to your co-presidency in 2021. Lots in store, so follow and stay tuned. So thank you, Noemi, and we'll welcome our next spotlight guest, Shamshar Virk. Hello. Among the many arts organizations that have joined the grid is 01, one of the oldest and most experienced art and technology organizations in the Bay Area. It was founded in 2000 at the height of the dot-com boom. And here with us today is Shamshar, Executive Director of 01. Hello.
Hi, Clara and Martin. Such a pleasure to be with you.
Can everyone see Shamshar? Okay, excellent. Okay. And everyone else as well, I see. Okay. So, Shamshar, the first 01 Biennale in 2006 featured 250 art installations and presented 40 countries. So quite the success. However, over the past 6 years, you've actually focused on a different project that was the American Arts Incubator, an initiative of the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, developed in partnership with 01. So, so to speak, a cultural relations and cultural diplomacy project by the U.S. State Department. It is a creative exchange program that sends U.S. artists abroad to collaborate with local communities in each exchange country during a month-long incubator. So it's an exemplary approach for innovative cultural relations. Now I'm working my way towards the question. So unsurprisingly, Corona proved to be quite a challenge for everyone, especially cultural facilitators that work in the field of, in the business of bringing people together, right? So it disrupted all the artistic exchanges and all the bridges that have been built. And in the midst of this global pandemic, also the grid had to kind of shift gears, and our cultural activities went entirely virtual. We even decided to launch a new format, which went well. This was almost an act of defiance. Insofar as we said, especially now in times of crisis, this is where the world needs art, where the world needs artists, where the only way to make sense of all that is happening to us is through art. And we needed to lift us up, to heal, to communicate, and at the end of the day, also to pilot new ideas that might even pave the way out of this mess. So the question to you is, you've been in this business for a while, and you've seen lots of trends in Silicon Valley go up and down. And now with this new challenge ahead, how do you create shared experiences, community, and a sense of togetherness in our current state of isolation? You had to pilot this and just jump in the cold water with the AAI program in 2020. So what are the lessons you learned, and what is lost, what is gained, and what are the takeaways for everyone who's listening and is in the business of cultural relations?
Thanks, Clara. Well, lots to talk about in that realm. But yes, I'll start with a few comments about American Arts Incubator, our partnership with the State Department, and what it was like to transition that online. And then I would love to speak more about the grid as well and the local experience here in San Francisco. You know, as you can imagine, switching what were a series of in-person month-long cultural exchanges to a virtual format was a pretty major shift. And I have to say, although we embarked on it, you know, with all the hopes and dreams for a positive season, we really weren't sure if we were going to be able to create, most importantly, the kind of cultural connection that we would normally see as a result of in-person exchange. And thankfully, you know, we found that actually the experience of connecting online, specifically in the ways that we do through our incubator model, was actually really effective in producing many of the same impacts. So we saw that there was the participants and the artists who were involved reflected back to us a really sincere sense of cultural exchange, that there was a connection across difference through this shared screen time. So even without the sights and smells and sounds of being in another place and sharing in all of those sort of nuances of cultural difference, we did see really meaningful cultural exchange happening. I think I credit a lot of that to the collaborative, co-creative activities that are a big part of the type of cultural exchange that we run. I think that bringing people together to creatively work on a problem or on an issue really starts to activate a sort of inner sense of ideation that you don't see in I don't necessarily see in a discourse model where you're just talking. I think making things is really important. You know, another thing that we were surprised to discover from the experience was that, as you all know, I'm sure, the experience of the pandemic has been incredibly isolating. It's been really challenging, just at a personal level, in terms of mental health. And we were hearing from artists and participants that the experience of being in a co-creative laboratory in this cultural exchange was really like a medicine during this time, where feelings of isolation were really assuaged by these connections through creating across difference. So those would, two quick highlights anyway from our experience, and generally a positive report back that moving online, we've learned that digital connection, virtual gathering, virtual exchange is still an incredibly powerful way to connect across borders.
So Shamsha, then let's talk about your collaboration with the grid. As 01, as Clara mentioned, you're not just one of our dear local partners in the network, but you also participated in the festival. You had 3 curated interactive experiences with incubator artists of 01. If you look at the potential of working with a global network, and global in the sense that there's many European partners teaming up with partners from the San Francisco Bay Area, what you see is the potential here for the local arts community. And maybe you could talk a little bit also about the local arts community here in Silicon Valley. It's a very peculiar place, very close to the big tech companies and platforms. What does it mean for local artists and art institutions?
Absolutely, Martin. So, just to say at the start, the potential of this kind of gathering that the grid is really embarking upon is very interesting for us on many levels. Bringing European outside perspective, external perspective to the local conditions of Silicon Valley and San Francisco is incredibly valuable. Having the comparative study, looking at what's happening in urban centers in Europe and comparing that to what's happening here in the US, also very valuable. And I think really, specific to the San Francisco context is this really unique moment that we're living through, where we've seen, this meteoric rise of corporate tech, of big T tech, and many, secondary effects that are being caused by that. Certainly we as an organization that started our life in San Jose, at the time, the center of Silicon Valley, and have moved north to San Francisco, in line with the movement of tech companies up into San Francisco, we're seeing issues like gentrification and homelessness and all these sort of secondary effects of that shift of people and capital. And the arts sector in San Francisco has long been, celebrated as a countercultural bastion, as a place for that welcomes dissent, that welcomes experimentation, alternative lifestyles, and alternative forms of creation. So this, the advent of the grid at this moment is giving us a new perspective or a new way to look at this tension that exists between corporate tech and countercultural art. And as media arts organizations, those of us who worked as content partners with the grid, Gray Area, Codame, Mutech, and 01, we are all really living at this border between the two worlds, where many of the artists we work with have day jobs working in big tech, and yet live off of their art in the rest of their life. Some of the artists are working fully in the arts field and having to figure out how to resource that lifestyle. So I think looking at the local issues and specifically the tension between art and technology in Silicon Valley is something the grid can do with a unique external perspective.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for for honoring the grid with those very profound words. That means a lot to us, and it really motivates us to continue working in this field, connecting all the dots, especially back to Europe, which is a conversation that I think increasingly that we increasingly need to have in Silicon Valley. So we often ask ourselves, what is the contribution that Europe can have in Silicon Valley? Since this is already a completely internationalized and it's the brains of the world. So it's not specifically American. It's just a cosmopolite merging of all cultures and tech workers from all around the world. And we often think that what is needed is more art in tech. So I'm really curious about this historic perspective that 01 is able to have on this issue, since it is an organization that has been around through multiple, as I said, ups and downs that the Silicon Valley had to go through, the different booms. And if you compare the current moment or the current techlash that Silicon Valley is experiencing with, say, the .com rise, can you find any parallels or any patterns that arise? Anything that cultural facilitators could work with, or we'd really appreciate a bird perspective.
Well, I'm happy to provide the perspective I can bring to this. I mean, I will admit that I am, compared to the .com boom, at least a relatively recent arrival. I've been in the Bay Area for just about 12 years now, so somewhere about a decade ago is when I began to familiarize myself with the scene. And what I've seen, at least during that time, is really a whole new relationship between the arts and technology. I think in the early days, during the .com boom, there was a very countercultural feel to Silicon Valley itself. Many of the people who were pioneering technologies and businesses in that area saw themselves as kin with the arts world and with the countercultural cultural world of San Francisco. As the tech world has grown over these recent decades and become more corporate, there's been more of a divide. So I think that divide is more stark now than it was back in the day. And that, of course, presents an opportunity to bring those worlds together through acts of translation and community building. I mean, I think the role that we see at 01 art playing in society is really one of making the case for artists as civic actors, that the practice of co-creation, collaboration, and of creation itself is one that shouldn't be taken and isolated in a studio or a gallery space. So to chart our development as an organization, we've really moved from showcasing artists in a more traditional format, where we were making the case for media arts as a in having to compare that to painting or some traditional form of art, and saying, no, media artist is real art, let's put it in galleries and prove that point. Now we've really moved far beyond that, and we're looking at how we can use media arts and the practices of transdisciplinary collaboration to really get deeper into public discourse around issues that matter, be they environmental, social, or cultural.
Shamsha, in order to complete this really, really interesting conversation with you, in one sentence again, if you had one wish to the global tech industry here in Silicon Valley, what would you ask?
Ooh, one wish. Well, that's a challenging question, of course, but I would say really just to reflect on history and to look at how important culture has been over the centuries at really building robust societies that are generating true innovation and equity for the population. And I think art has a lot that can contribute to that conversation.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Shamshar. As always, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Please, everyone, check out the American Arts Incubator, because most of the artworks that have been created this year in 2020 can be found online. Is that right, Shamshar?
That is right. Yeah, we leaned hard into virtual spaces. So there are many virtual galleries and virtual spaces within Mozilla Hubs you can explore through our website, AmericanArtsIncubator.org, for the program.
And also, of course, the 3 interactive experiences that Shamshar and 01 have curated for exposure, you can find them online on our YouTube channel as well. So thank you so much, Shamshar. And with that, we'll move on to our next spotlight. And we welcome Vanessa Chang. Yay! Hello, Vanessa.
Hey, Clara. Hi, Martin. Great to see you.
Also, one of our great co-conspirators, co-pilots, investigator, a jack of all trades. Vanessa is a very versatile woman with an incredible knowledge on not only the Bay Area's historic roots in art and tech, but cultural history as a whole. And that's why we have voted her as a cluster to be our principal investigator for the Art and Tech Report 2020. And also she happened to be co-curator of exposure. So you'll see her in many of the panels if you watch online. So the Art and Tech Report 2020 is an idea that came up in 2019 when we published our first report, which was shorter and done by different people and very accomplished. And in 2020, we said, we'll choose Vanessa for the task and give her a bit more time. So the findings can be even more in-depth. So building upon the report of 2019, you'll publish a new investigation that was meant to map out the art and technology ecosystem in the Bay Area and try to pave a way for the grid of how such a network could actually have an important role in mitigating the space of artists, technologists, and policymakers from both Europe and Silicon Valley. So in these 15 minutes where we have a spotlight just on you and your findings, we want to basically talk about your findings and give a little bit like a small sneak peek into the publication, and then also announce that we'll have a talk, a notes talk. Noemi has been showcasing this series of Art and Tech Talks. We'll have a notes talk on December 10th, I think at 10 a.m. Not entirely sure. I'll search it for in a second. And Vanessa will talk about the findings much more in depth. But for now, what are your preliminary findings, if I can just throw you in the cold water like this?
Sure thing. Well, what I've found is that there's this, we're in a really interesting moment, for one. The last few years has seen a surge of international interest in practices at the intersection of art and technology for more traditional art, academic, and governmental institutions. Of course, a lot of this work is rooted in the Bay Area and greater Silicon Valley. So I've been interviewing folks from the art and technology ecosystem, museums, colleges, universities, art collectives, tech companies, foundations, artists, and technologists. And it quickly brought me farther afield than Silicon Valley, but I tried to kind of stay within that scope and draw those insights from abroad. Broadly, what I found is that people are invested and committed in this work here, and their evolution reflects larger historical shifts in the tech industry. But there is, as Shamshar was mentioning, a longer historical entwinement between culture and technology, and it's really struggling with long-term sustainability. So I want to highlight a few related observations from the investigation and how I think the grid might position itself vis-a-vis these observations. So first, artists working with advanced technologies, as well as the organizations that support them, have long existed in a marginal space. They straddle and cross disciplines, sectors, and audiences. So there's been a a shift lately. This year, the National Endowment for the Arts has been conducting its own study on art and technology. Serpentine Galleries in London has also published some work. So there's a lot of interest here. But what they're finding is that, and what I've found as well, is that artists doing this kind of work are on the margins. They're on the margins of the art world. They're on the margins of the tech world. And the contours of that ecosystem, they're there and they're robust, but they're really fragmented. So a lot of these artists are creating networks on their own. They're doing that to support the kind of practice that they want. They're doing that to connect themselves with equipment, with knowledge and technical expertise. They're creating these networks to marshal their own audiences. They're not typically getting funding from traditional art foundations because those categories and the way that we talk about them in traditional spaces don't really exist yet. They need to mature. And so, you know, there are some changes. This year there was the Uncanny Valley exhibition at the De Young Museum. So there's increasing kind of interest from the traditional art world. But because the artists and technologists working in this space are already building these networks, albeit in an ad hoc way, those could use fortification, right? And really thoughtful attention to who those players are. You know, our last year's study, Nadav and Alex talked about the need for someone to connect and to connect between actors and to do that education work. That is happening, but it is really fragmented, right? And a big part of that is because of you know, the lack of language to talk about it and to describe this work, the lack of traditional kind of training pathways. You know, there are a lot of art and technology programs in academic institutions, and academic institutions are actually what sustain a lot of people trying to do this work because it's really hard to make a living in it, or they're coming from tech companies. So where the grid can really, I think, step in is to kind of recognize how these networks are already being built and to really fortify that and to kind of create, you know, some people have asked for centralized knowledge bases, right, where they can actually access this kind of information, or actual, you know, more conferences, because they can count it on one hand, at least in the US, kind of this work that's happening. So that's one major, major finding, right, that this is very much in the making. There's a lot of interest right now, and there's a lot of opportunity to define what those networks can look like as they kind of solidify, and also that it's really urgent that we do that. I also found, digging into the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, that it's more tech and art than art and tech, as one way to put it. So, you know, there's this fraught history in Silicon Valley between technology and culture. As one artist told me, he sees an asymmetry of power in art and technology because tech companies design the technologies and accumulate so much of the capital around it. And this work is really expensive. So there's a really robust suite of communities doing this work in the Bay Area, from San Francisco to San Jose. There are myriad academic institutions, from SFAI to Stanford to San Jose State, where the second media lab in the country was founded. Countercultural organizations like Gray Area, 01, countercultural labs, lots of activism and conversation, but a lot of fracture because there's a lot of suspicion about how much things are oriented towards the tech industry. So a lot of the people I spoke to feel like the Bay Area has so much unmet potential. Here, I'd like to quote an artist I was talking to because it's such a wonderful metaphor. He said, "It's a political landscape that's pockmarked. It's like a mashup of the moon and the rainforest. There's places of lush, verdant opportunity and barren landscapes of pockmarked asteroid collisions where ideas around innovation was spawned and destroyed by meteor strike." So if that doesn't speak to the unique kind of cultural ferment of this area, but this challenge that a lot of artists and organizations face in sustaining that practice, I think that's a really rich observation. So much of this discourse around funding and support is directed towards tech companies, this really kind of patchy support of the arts. People identify the support as tied to hype cycles around technology. So 10, 15 years ago, 3D printing, and then there was the VR moment. Now there's the AR and AI moment. And so these are typically the moments when technology companies might kind of step out and look for creative people to work on those technologies. And that's defined that nature of that engagement, the lush, verdant opportunity among the pockmarked asteroid landscape that he describes. And I think it's important, Shamshir mentioned this history of the counterculture in the Bay Area. For all the constellation of wealth in Silicon Valley, I mean, there's this historic decline in support for the arts. The last 10 years have seen this seismic shift and this decline in support for the arts in the Bay Area, and a lot of companies launching their own programs and being able to kind of legislate how those are run. I think it's really important, and part of what I'm trying to do in this report is highlight that there really is this entwined history of technology and culture in the Bay Area, and the counterculture, and it's rooted in the counterculture of the 1960s, where the language that you use to talk about art technology is also descends from. And so the way people describe this is that culture has been extracted from technology, and that big tech kind of extracts from the city, it extracts from the kind of culture of the area without giving back. So I want to highlight that ongoing history and suggest that this is a real opportune moment because of COVID, but because of peaking interest in this field, to redefine these art ecosystems, particularly in the Bay Area, and really mitigate this extractive relationship. What is really important as we build those systems, and the grid is really poised to do that connective work, is that they have to be non-extractive networks built on care. And they have to honor the different kinds of stakeholders so that it's art as well as technology and policy, and not so centered around technology itself. COVID has also amplified and aggravated systemic inequalities of race, class, and ability. So as these networks are built, those voices have to be centered as well. Black, Indigenous people of color, folks with disabilities, women, and other people doing transformative work in this space. As the table is being put together, they really need to be at it. And finally,
Vanessa,
one last,
maybe just maybe because we're kind of running out of time, and I want to get to one question that was raised actually in a panel earlier. And you've mentioned so many of the issues and also difficulties that artists are facing, and that the art ecosystem is facing in terms of funding, and also in terms of the imbalance of power. So one of the discussions we had earlier was, when we talk about these art and tech collaborations, the artists working together with technologists. What do we need to be careful about, and how do we need to shape them, and what were your findings there? Because there's concern, and those concerns were raised about the possibility of artists being exploited and being instrumentalized for PR, for whatever other reasons.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the way we talk about collaboration, creativity, interdisciplinarity descend from an earlier political moment, right? When this 1960s moment when a lot of these collaborations happened, and scholars have written how that rhetoric of collaboration is divorced from that political context. So as we think about building those relationships, we need to be attentive to our political moment. There needs to be a way to redefine a shared language and new ways of working together that are attentive to this political moment. There needs to be someone or an organization with experience in every side of the space, really mediating those relationships. They have to be very bespoke. And I think so much of the language is oriented towards the tech industry, and everyone's like, well, if you really want to find ways to support and get funding and support from tech, you need to talk about metrics. Well, part of that enterprise of defining language will have to be about defining metrics. One of the artists I spoke to said, art is about inventing the measure, not applying the measure. So as we kind of set up these networks, artists have to be at the table defining what success looks like, what the kind of central political concerns are. They have to be supported kind of culturally in how this collaborations is staged as well.
On that notion, that was a perfect point to end this conversation. This is, I repeat, a short spotlight. The publication of the report, which is going to be excellent and will be circulated throughout the entire EUNIC network, will be published at the end of the year. drafted by yours dearly, Vanessa Chang. So thank you so much for joining us today and giving us a little sneak peek into what to expect. Also, please join our Nodes talks. The first one will happen on November 19th, which happens to be on Thursday. And afterwards, we'll have Vanessa's session on the Art and Tech Report 2020 on December 10th. And with that, we move on to our next spotlight, which is like a mini panel discussion on a topic that is much too broad to be discussed in 40 minutes, but we'll try it nonetheless. So welcome Tobias Rees, Director of the Berggruen Institute, and Patrick Hebron, Creator and Head of the Machine Intelligence Design Group at Adobe. Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in Movember. Very well done, Tobias.
Movember, yes. Thanks for pointing it out. I don't usually look like this.
We love strong statements. Okay, so let's just jump right in it. One topic that Martin and I discuss plenty is that in our work reality, it sometimes feels as if artists, technologists, and policymakers simply don't share the same reality. This is best illustrated during the recent congressional hearings of big tech CEOs, for example. And so when you hear a policymaker or even a politician utter the words truth, human intelligence, or technology, what they mean, the meaning of those words and those connotations vary greatly from how, for example, a technologist or an artist would use or even understand these terms. Furthermore, when you then talk to an artist or a philosopher, they will argue that in our post-truth society, and with more and more applications by artificial intelligence, the ground beneath our feet has become increasingly unstable. So it kind of feels like our reality is starting to fragment. So this short conversation is cued to talk about perhaps a new initiative to create a universal language for artists, technologists, and policymakers to mitigate the space of how future technologies can be more humane, more inclusive, and serve the interest of all of humanity. So how do we create this common understanding of digital world? How do we create, again, a common understanding of reality? And with that, I hand over to Patrick and Tobias, and basically just whoever wants to chime in first, grab the microphone. We'll do the rest.
Please, Patrick.
Thanks, Clara. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff to unpack there. So I mean, I think I often feel that anything that's been sort of in the culture for about 100 years sort of tends to feel to people as if it's always existed. And so sort of the premise of truth in photography sort of has that feel. I think it is in fact lost. Perhaps it was never really there. In that while there might be sort of indexical truth in the sense that, the camera observed the rays of light that it observed, what those rays represent in a cultural context or in terms of sort of the underlying meaning of what's happening in the world was already sort of a tenuous relationship. Now it turns out that we can't trust those rays of light either. I think this is a permanent state. Adobe and the New York Times and Twitter have this initiative called the Content Authentication Initiative. It's often misunderstood. It has to do with tracking the provenance of an image to say, that this sort of went, from this type of camera to this editing tool, et cetera, sort of a blockchain kind of a thing. I think that can largely be successful in tracking provenance. However, the potential of failure is perhaps worse than doing nothing at all, right? If you think you have a trusted mechanism, but you in fact don't, particularly if it's been defeated by a small number of people, like a state actor, this is potentially the most insidious opportunity of all. Nonetheless, I think, while it is a loss in certain respects, perhaps there is something gained in that, philosophically, it sort of returns us to, the possibility that reality does not have a singular reductive meaning, and that in fact that we sort of have to see beyond what appears to be hard evidence in our investigations of the world.
Yeah, I would add to this a couple of thoughts. I would like to add a couple of thoughts. One of them is, I think it's fair to say that you know, there is a prominent discourse about photography as a capture, as a representation of something that's out there, that's independent from the photo. And of course, a photo is chemistry, right? It's liquid, so to speak. And in that sense, there is a space of possibility. But what we have, I mean, a space of possibility of interpreting the lays of right, so to speak. I think what we have seen over the last 5 or so years with the coming together of deep reinforcement learning, convolutional neural nets, and GANs, or generative adversarial networks, is increasing that space of possibility to such a degree that the entire older framework of understanding what a photographic image is at the very least decentered. I was going to say becomes useless. That's maybe a little too strong, because bits and pieces will be useful. But I think that what we are seeing is a shift in what we understand by visual truth, where a photo becomes basically software, where a photo becomes data and AI. And it's impossible at this point to disentangle data as in the sense of, you know, pixels and AI. They're inseparably interwoven. There is no baseline. And I find that what an image is a more open question right now than ever. There is the emergence of the non-human, and we humans have been good with accepting non-humans in nature. We accept non-human agency in nature, but that there is non-human agency on the level of machines or technology is kind of new. The only discourse that exists around it is usually super intelligence. So it's all negative. Everything is doomed. Machines will take over and kill us all, which is kind of interesting because the creative potential unleashed by the arrival of non-human agency in a creative field is extraordinary and is actually experimentally exciting. So I'm missing a little bit the embrace of the loss of a naive concept of reality in favor of an experimental coming together of humans, non-humans, in negotiating almost. It's almost as if, yeah, provocatively put, let's say that what visual reality has become a conversation, and the conversation is more than human.
So Tobias and Patrick, I find that this very interesting here, because you both have, kind of have an artistic, philosophical background, and you actually know what you're talking about when you talk about these tools. On the one hand, these digital tools, of course, Adobe creates some of these digital tools that create these kind of new reality, this new visual reality. So, and I think it's also very interesting that you point to the potential of these new technologies like machine learning and neural networks in not only increasing the potential, but asking ourselves fundamental questions about reality that we probably should have asked ourselves in the first place. So I would like to, since this is about artificial intelligence, the question I would like to ask to both of you is to talk a little bit about this potential of AI and machine intelligence. I think Patrick said in a recent interview that machine intelligence can provide a counterpoint to human intelligence. What does it mean to point to this potential of a non-human intelligence, and what does it mean in practice? How do we have to imagine this AI tools that work and interact with the creative process of humans?
So yeah, it's a great question. A few thoughts, unless Tobias, you'd like to start.
My thoughts are too unordered at this moment. It seems to lead away from what Martin has been asking, but the association that your question triggered in me is a history of visibility, if you will, is a history of almost visual truth or something like that. And if you if you just focus on Europe for a second, then we know that there are basically no landscape paintings, for example, before the 14th or 15th century, right? Giotto is usually the first, and it's almost always linked in historical accounts to the invention of the central perspective. So Brunelleschi, Alberti, Leonardo, right? Galilei draws with his hands and uses basically geometry and the central perspective. And imagine for a moment that visuality of uncultivated land was overwhelming for humans. It was threatening, it was actually making people fearful to leave the village or the cultivated land. And imagine that the tools of painting as science, basically central perspective and geometry, tamed the visual, made it, first it sort of made nature independent of humans, but also made humans sort of not outside of it and in control of it, made it seeable, visible. Photography fits perfectly into that story. And when you have now the arrival of machine learning and you have the arrival of non-human agency, then this is, provocatively put, the biggest event in the art history of visibility since the invention of the central perspective. And what's at the center of this? Adobe Photoshop. Right? So now I just increased the stakes dramatically, but somewhat sincerely, by saying what's at stake is visual truth, is how the human understood it, how humans are at home in it. What's at stake are conventions of truth, the link between, the shift in the 17th century between evidencia as an inner sort of seeing a first truth, like divine truth, where you have to close your eyes to see, and Descartes' simple, everyone can see what's evident, just open your eyes, this like outside visibility that is so incredibly important for the rise of democracies and enlightenment. All of this seems to be at stake in what is happening right now. And when we talk about deep fakes, which is the classical way of problematizing machine learning or deep learning and photography, then we assume there is a baseline. It's a fake. There is the real thing. But what, as Patrick said at the beginning, like the baseline is gone. Like this reference is in itself part of the order of illusions, so to speak. That's a pretty wild moment. That's like a massive experimental philosophical event where reality and how to experience it, and truth and negotiation of truth as a political challenge in which non-humans are involved is serious, is like real. And the best way to address it, I feel, is to bring philosophers, artists, engineers, and policymakers together in a big room and discuss that. Discuss what it means, discuss experiments, and then do them.
So something I'd like to add is, I think that it's very hard to know yourself without the contrast of another, and this is a great opportunity from AI. And so the pursuit of trying to replicate a human-like intelligence in machines is, I think, one, beyond a big challenge, but two, I'm not sure that it's a particularly desirable goal. I think it's not contrastive enough. I think in terms of, just to touch very briefly on the challenge, it is an architectural challenge, but I think actually maybe more than anything else, it is a simulation challenge, right? The acculturation and the context in which a human, learns about the world is not in isolation. And if you compare with, say, the tragic case of a child being locked in the basement for years, right, and what person emerges from that, or people growing up in different cultures, right, we can see that obviously very small sort of differences have big impacts. And so, like, the probably much larger sort of gaps in our simulation potential of trying to replicate a kind of, quote, human life for a machine would be so great that I find it challenging to imagine that we would arrive at such a thing with, nonetheless, I'm not so sure that there is immense value in it. I think that, that sort of the more valuable thing is to start to think about intelligence as something that can sort of act as a building block and that then we can use in much the same way that, that say the Pythagorean theorem is a very fundamental building block in the world of architecture, right? You don't just apply it once, you scale it up and you sort of use it over and over and sort of leverage in through scaffolding that very basic principle to do something very complex and which serves a much larger goal. And so I think that that's something that we have not sort of done philosophically yet to really start to sort of parse what is the atomicity of intelligence. I think it's something that I always find very interesting to note is that there is a really strong correlation between the equations that are used in machine learning and in thermodynamics. And so it suggests, perhaps, without being sort of too wishy-washy or hippie-ish about it, that in some ways sort of the fundamental building blocks that constitute intelligence are perhaps not exactly what we imagine ourselves to be, and that if we can get at sort of the root of that, one, that may sort of help us to understand our own sort of being better, and two, also will allow us to sort of scaffold tools that we can stand on top of and use in increasingly sophisticated ways.
I want to ask a question about this, if I may. What if intelligence were not one, but many? I.e., what if the basic building blocks of intelligence of different kinds of intelligences would not break down? I mean, mathematically, they may break down, but in terms of actual architectures, they may not break down to single building blocks, so to speak. So one way of putting this is to juxtapose machine learning and good old-fashioned AI. Good old-fashioned AI would basically say, right, intelligence is mind. Only humans have mind. Mind's a symbol operating system or manipulating system. That's that. So basically, good old-fashioned AI might be faster in some aspects or areas than human intelligence, but it remains human intelligence on steroids, so to speak. Whereas machine learning says, well, first, intelligence is actually learning, and second, it's the outcome of a neural architecture. Neural architectures come in many forms, shapes, and colors. And so intelligence just got transformed from one simple thing, intelligence with a capital I, into a series with many entries, some of which are, might be bacterial, some of which might be octopi, some of which human, but also animates or other AI systems or robots. So do you think that it's better to move from intelligence capital I to intelligences, lowercase I and plural, or do you think that deep learning ultimately is like the most important step yet taken towards an atomicity of intelligence, as you call it?
I think you're very right to point out that, so, to extend this analogy of atoms here, presumably there's at least not one element. Maybe there's sort of a common structure, right? That you have sort of nucleus and electrons or something like that. But there's at the very least, there's not one element, right? And where those things diverge, I think you point to good ones and that operate in sort of different ways, collective intelligence versus individual intelligence. I think also we have a hard time sort of assessing where we fall into that because, we don't have sort of quite the right vantage point to totally see all of our collective intelligence faculties, though maybe some. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it comes down to one, and I think again, the sort of the diversity of forms here is the significant thing, and that they are sort of given to different capabilities, and that this is really what we should encourage. Like, I mean, arguably for related reasons to why we should celebrate diversity in the human world is probably an argument that could more or less be extended into the world of machine intelligence too.
Yeah, I love that. There is also, from that perspective, a funny hope for a shared reality between these many different humans and non-humans, so to speak. So when you take there's this famous early 20th century Jacob von Uexküll who invented the term Umwelt or surrounding world, right? And he basically said, well, we humans think that a dog sees the world just exactly like we see it, or a fruit fly, except that, you know, they see it a little less sharp or a little less colorful or something like that. And he says, but that's completely wrong. Every animal has basically its own world, so to speak. And he gives the example of a tick that has only thermodynamics or sensing or smell. And that's it. The world of the tick is extremely limited compared to the human world. And what the world consists in basically depends on what he calls the Bauplan, the architecture of the whole organism. And yet that might be true for AI too, right? For how AI in photography, for example, may see the world will depend on its architecture, so to speak, what it's possible to do. Simultaneously, all of these different animals and machines presumably share one world that has a certain space of possibility within which you can constitute it differently depending on your architecture. So maybe there is a chance to learn from biology how to rescue truth.
I love that thought. I'd like to shift gears a little bit into, without entirely leaving the realm of this fascinating philosophical discussion, perhaps shift us back into the trenches of practical applications and real world implications at this point, and with the invited speakers. So we talked a great deal. I think, Patrick, you mentioned Pythagoras, you mentioned the laws of thermodynamics. So what happens when reality is no longer reliable? So what happens when the solid ground beneath our feet starts to liquefy? And so our relationship to truth is in jeopardy. And I think this is a reality that all of us can relate to, even though, frankly speaking, you also mentioned that there is a narrative about a photograph being a reliable source of information, but we do know that that has never been the case. And photography has always been a mise en scène and just a fragment of reality. And so that entire narrative was about was bound to crumble eventually. But now it is a different kind of manifestation, since we're now dealing with augmented reality, and every photo is, so to speak, has so many layers to it. I want to talk about a very present threat that I think has been is in all of our minds. And since you represent Adobe, I think it's important that we talk about deep fakes and basically the shifting of our reality. Tobias, you've also talked about everyone lives in their own world, and increasingly we're witnessing that everyone is more or less retreating into their own world, and we are giving up those bastions of common truth or common facts. So if the laws of thermodynamics are all of a sudden being in dispute and not even science reliable anymore, so what can we rely on? How can Adobe maybe contribute, or the Berggruen Institute, to finding this common ground yet again?
So I'm always fascinated by places of sort of co-occurrence in history. And you could say that it's a coincidence that what's happening in AI coincides temporally with what's happening in politics and identity politics, but I don't think it is a coincidence. I think that while you could say, oh, these technologies, they couldn't have happened until now, at the same time not, right? I mean, it's a matter of what we chose to pursue at what point in history, where we drove down, and a lot of machine learning really comes out of sort of one core concept of backpropagation, which is really just sort of an application of the chain rule in calculus. And so arguably in certain respects, machine learning was actually possible at the time of Newton and Leibniz. There's some practical problems with that, but so anyway, this co-occurrence I think is a really sort of interesting thing, and we have immense growing pains to go through culturally here in a transition of this, and I guess probably none of us know exactly what's going to come out the other side, but nonetheless we find ourselves here, and so there are very tricky questions with it. We just released a feature in Photoshop called neural filters. Amongst other things, it enables the ability to do translations in human faces of a variety of kinds. You know, some of them very sort of practical, probably not particularly objectionable to people, like, you know, shifting where the lighting angle is. But other things, you know, having sort of more contact with identity, such as age and so forth. Other things were possible too, and we chose to exclude them from the capabilities of this tool, but they are available to people in sort of open source software that doesn't even necessarily require a huge amount of programming prowess. You know, the implementation of the feature was actually probably less work than the validation of the feature and making sure that it would work, you know, on people of all different ethnic and, you know, racial and, you know, gender. And, you know, and then going beyond that into other things of, like, you know, that there are religiously significant tattoos that people could have on their faces. When we do transformations, are these preserved by the model? Indicative scars, all sorts of different things. And, you know, we had to really look at these and sort of do this study of what, you know, what both technologically and sort of culturally needed to happen there. It's a very complicated landscape, and I think one thing that I would just point out before I turn it over to Tobias is that, you know, you sort of want to have open the full possibility space and to not bring in sort of any of the sort of preconceived notions or biases into this. Often the data works against you in certain respects there. So I think the best example of this would be that there is, you know, a statistical correlation between age and wearing eyeglasses. Now, obviously some young people do, but the older you are, the higher the probability that you're wearing glasses. So when we train models to do sort of face transformations of aging or of glasses, it's very hard to make it such that we can sort of add glasses to your face without also potentially sort of making you look older, right? Now, this feels, of course, like a kind of bias, and at the same time, it is sort of rooted in the nature of the data. We can counter it, but it also has some ground truth, right? So these are very, very complicated questions, very hard to solve for an individual institution, and I think definitely, you know, the subject of sort of broader discourse is required.
May I just interject before Tobias answers, because we have a question of one of our viewers that maybe points a little bit to your pointing out of you know, these neural filters that Adobe has implemented, and the validation phase where you were also looking in particular of biases and then you talked a little bit about the problems you encounter. So the question is whether AI is becoming a neo-colonial and racist tool itself, and can art influence can art in technology influence that side of AI? I assume the question would be actually bringing artists into the development of such tools, whether that in some sense brings a different perspective and raises the awareness of any kind of ideological or other biases into the research process. There was also, of course, our viewer also pointed out that this is usually about white privileged men, and we are unfortunately also you know, lacking often diversity when we talk about these issues. But when we now really look at the research and development processes within the big companies, do you think there is a potential bringing in artists, bringing in philosophers, and addressing these biases better?
Absolutely, I think it's very important. You know, so you know, this I think is one of the great things that Tobias and the Berggruen Institute are doing in helping to connect those things with sort of the corporate development. You know, we also, of course, do really extensive you know, work with users and you know, everything from professional artists to hobbyists, and you know, we take that very seriously. We pay very close attention in a wide variety of settings, from sort of close conversations and ongoing conversations with artists that we have sort of enrolled in our programs for doing this, all the way through just looking at what people are saying about this in even Twitter or something like this. But yeah, I think it's very important to do that, and also for the teams to be conversant in this, to be thinking about it. So we try to assemble. We have an AI ethics committee which did a very rigorous study of this set of features and all of the things that went into its development. And so, yeah, I mean, 100% agree. And obviously, there's always going to be more work to be done to make this more and more the case.
Tobias, would you like to comment on this, or should we maybe move on more generally to creativity and artificial intelligence, to which you also want to come?
Maybe one quick note on this. So Clara made a link between Photoshop, or the loss of photographic truth, and the emergence of this fragmented reality. And the question just now discussed from the chat also points to, let's say, a political dimension of AI. Both of them do, right? And one challenge is that there is a poetics of AI, and then there is a politics of AI. And so when it comes to poetry or to art, we love the liquidification of reality. We love the loss of certainty. We look for it. we love the idea that truth is less obvious than it seems. But when it comes to politics, then we often rely on a discourse that sheds all of this. So it's very easy in an art circle to get excited about AI and the emergence of non-human agency, and it's not reducible to humans anymore, and it's surplus really, or what makes it interesting lies in all those things that humans cannot do, and how it opens our sense of or experience of reality. But when it comes to politics, we often treat AI as just a tool. It's a social technical system. It was invented by humans, will be used by humans to human ends. It is nothing in itself. So there is an interesting tension here. And I think that our older politics is not suited to come to terms with AI. It would basically mean to deprive AI of what it can contribute. That does obviously not mean that there are not serious political challenges. And so how to sort of approach the political from the perspective of the poetic, where poetic or art means all that cannot be subsumed under how we have been doing things. That means, for example, how we have been criticizing things, or for how we have been theorizing things, is one of the foremost challenges. And our work with Patrick is I think a good example for this. We try to find out what is new and different here, and how can one stabilize this as a positive moment. And we need philosophers for that, because someone needs to know the history of thought and thinking in order to identify what is new and different. One needs artists who can tangibly explore these new spaces, who basically build a philosophical product, so to speak, and can help engineers build philosophical products too. With an art piece, it's easy. Everyone accepts that it has a philosophical agency, that it somehow works on you, but we usually don't grant that to technical products, but there's no reason why that's the case.
My sincere apologies. There was a little bit of a schedule conflict on my end, and I unfortunately have to drop a few minutes early. I'm very, very sorry, and loved being a part of this conversation. Thank you for having me in.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Patrick.
So much, Patrick.
Thank you very much. Talk to you. Bye.
Talk soon. All right.
Go ahead, Clara.
Yes, that leaves the three of us for the final round, the bonus round. We only have a couple more minutes left, and want to wrap this up in a satisfactory way, so that people, especially cultural facilitators working in this space, having to navigate these uncertain waters. I'd be really curious, your perspective, your vision, your experience in this field. What are your recommendations for people trying to navigate art, tech, cultural relations, policy, diplomacy? Is there anything, a guiding star that you rely on, some sort of compass, anything that you would recommend or give them on their way?
Sure, I do think that is. That at first may seem very complicated, because engineers are often not interested in what we would call culture or philosophy or art. But one of the most curious features of the present is that the questions concerning the human or concerning art are today basically playing out in machine learning. And I give one very brief, very concrete example. My very first encounter with Ilya Sutskever at OpenAI was that I met him and said, "Hey, Ilya, I'm so happy to meet you." And he literally responded, "I'm not sure this makes sense." And, it was like, wow, off to a great start. And I said, "Well, what do you mean? I was so much looking forward to meeting you." He said, "Well, you're an anthropologist." I said, "Yeah, and you're an engineer." And he replied, "Exactly." I said, "Well, you have to tell me more." So it was this completely awkward situation where I had to sort of fight to get into that I had to be accepted to be good enough for a discourse, basically. And he said, "Well, you're interested in humans." And then he recognized he said something potentially problematic, right? Because you have to be interested in humans. So he said, "Well, it's not that I'm not interested in humans, don't get me wrong, but I'm really interested in machines and how to build them and in how they will change the world." And I said, "Well, I think that's exactly why we should talk." And he looked confused and said, "Now you have to explain to me what you mean." And I said, "Well, today the machine, which is traditionally the non-human, is used as a model for how to understand humans. So building machines suddenly has an anthropological dimension. I think it's really important that we take that serious and insert philosophers and anthropologists in the lab." And that was the beginning of a joint project. And so whenever one succeeds in telling engineers, you build radically new things, and they get excited. And then say, "Yeah, but they outgrow our old reality." And yeah, they get excited. They disrupt everything. Absolutely. And then so, well, that also means that you actually don't know what you're doing, right? Because you build new things. It's beyond what we already know. Shouldn't philosophers and artists be part of that exploratory process? Not as an add-on, let them build the product and then we come and humanize the product, as they call it, but in the very earliest stages of product development. And I think every cultural institution, wherever there are AI people, can invite them and say, "Hey, in your work, what the human is, what truth is, what living together could mean, what news is, and what opportunities one has to consume news are remade. Should we talk?" And I think that in my experience, almost like the readiness to work together and to think together is there, but one has to build these conversations where they have the philosophical dignity that they change things, but then also instantly the philosophical responsibility.
Tobias, maybe one kind of last question, talking really about the work of your institute, the Berkman Institute, and your aspirations also to make these collaborations between thinkers, artists, policymakers, and technologists a reality. And you are making them in some parts a reality, and you're also partnering with us, with the GRID, to bring these fundamental questions to the forefront of technologists' minds. So I would like to ask you kind of how do tech people from big tech, and I know that you have very relationships with tech executives, how do they react to your proposition, and is there a willingness of coming from technology companies to engage with these questions even, and let alone letting in the kind of people that pose these questions? And do you see a potential for these conversations happening within the big tech companies, and what kind of format would they take? So actually a lot of questions, but maybe you can give us a little bit of a perspective finally for the upcoming collaborations.
Right. Thoughts, please.
Well, I do think that there is a big readiness for these conversations, and I don't think that the readiness is, one often hears this, "Oh, well, they're in big trouble. They have feared, ethics, and they should talk to us. If not now, when then?" We have never, although we talk about critical things, we've never had this negative discourse with them. So our conversations almost always are about the difference today makes with respect to yesterday. What is fundamentally new, like the creation of a new reality, and how can we help them identify what the newness is and attend to it? And the easiest and maybe most relatable example for people outside of tech is the Bauhaus, the famous 1920s German design school. The Bauhaus people all saw very clearly that the 19th century is over, that the sort of artisanal manufacturing is over, that you get the industrialization of architecture, you get standardization, you get mass production of products. And they literally wanted to own that new moment. They wanted to build products with a philosophical agency. Walter Gropius is famous to have told a journalist after he had talked to Marcel Breuer, "You want to change humanity? Build new chairs, my friend, build new chairs." And he walked away. So the one entry prize is to be able to find the philosophical and the artistic on the level of the very, very nitty-gritty concrete that the engineers do. And that's actually a real challenge, because what might be very close to the nitty-gritty for a philosopher is still miles away from the nitty-gritty for an engineer. So how to enter that discourse and be able to render visible the philosophical, the poetic, and the political in what the engineers on a daily basis do, that's the secret, I think. But then if one can render it, we call it the PPP approach, philosophy, poetry, and politics. If one can render the PPP visible to the engineers in their work, in what they do, then we have only had positive reactions.
Thank you so much. This is highly inspiring and clearly motivating for our work and all the projects we have in the pipeline for 2021. We look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Tobias, you're such a pleasure to talk to. It's fascinating, and it's a shame that we only had 40 minutes to do so, but this is clearly just a small spotlight of all the amazing things we have in store with the grid. So thank you so much for joining us today, the EUNIC Digital AI Week, Tobias, Rees, and Patrick Ibron. And for our final spotlight.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to work with you, and what you're doing is awesome. Thank you.
Likewise. All right, handing over to Martin.
Thank you so much, Tobias. And you talked about the nitty-gritty, how to reach software engineers. So now we're going to talk to one and also about a concrete project of an artistic collaboration with an R&D lab that we did in the context of the grid. So I want to welcome Brian Mccann. He is the co-founder of CTO of a startup of which we cannot say the name yet because it's in stealth mode. But we got to know Brian when he was still working for Salesforce, as was mentioned before, one of the big tech giants in Silicon Valley, in the AI R&D lab. And together with Richard Socher, who was leading the lab, and they approached us and asked us in order to test and try out and improve an AI algorithm. It was called Control. They wanted to work together with a writer. And so we identified this writer, Daniel Kehlmann, very well known in the German-speaking world, but also been translated into English and several other languages. The Measurement of the World was his big novel, which made him famous. And we contacted Daniel, and a very, very interesting collaboration ensued, really testing and talking and reflecting on this algorithm, which was a natural language processing algorithm called Control. So Brian, welcome to our final spotlight. And maybe let's start a little bit about your perspective in this collaboration, about this project first with Daniel. What were your findings? Why were you interested in such a collaboration? And what surprised you in actually working on an algorithm that was not really yet finished, so to speak, when talking and interacting with a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, well, first of all, going off of the last session, I definitely am going to put like build chairs above my desk now. I've actually never heard that phrase of, if you want to have impact, like build chairs. I really like that. And in many ways, my time in research, working with Richard, working with the rest of the Salesforce team, was about building such chairs, and starting out with chairs that maybe had one leg and you couldn't really use them, and then we got kind of like little stools, and then we got little backs. And control is the name of this algorithm that we were working on, that is kind of in a class of other kinds of AI and technology called language models. And what they do is generate text, and they can do that by taking in a prompt, taking some input text, usually a fairly small amount of text, and then they output some new text. So a few years ago, these were definitely the stool without a chair. They would repeat themselves all of the time. They seemed like maybe a fun novelty, but a lot of us sitting there playing with them saw potentially that something amazing could come out of them. And what we've really seen in the last few years is a huge improvement in these kinds of models. And a lot of it comes from the amount of compute that large companies and universities are investing in this kind of technology. It's also coming from just being able to obtain and find a lot more data, so that these models can, metaphorically speaking, kind of read as much of the internet as they possibly can, all of the text that's out there. And by doing so, they, again, kind of with this metaphorical language of AI, like learn how to predict which words are going to come next. And so with control, we had taken kind of some previous algorithms that were language models, and we wanted to see what would happen if we gave them a lot of data, and also included some knobs and dials that would allow a human to control the output a little more. So instead of just having the language model output whatever word it thinks is most likely or should come next, actually allow a human to go into the AI like after it's trained, more like a tool rather than like an anthropomorphized thing like out there that you don't like control like an AI entity, but maybe as a tool you can use it to do something. So we trained it in a slightly different way, and the way we organized the data allowed us to, for example, change the style of the text that it was being generated, or change the domain. So what was really interesting as these things were getting better was this question of, is it good enough yet for someone that's a creative person to use it to enhance their creativity and actually help them make things in the world and do their creative process better, or at all, actually, with Daniel, since Daniel was the first one. So yeah, we were so happy to work with you and work with Daniel. Daniel came out on Valentine's Day last year, and we spent the day together, which was lovely. And we really spent the whole day with this algorithm control. We let Daniel kind of play with it, and I kind of educated him about how it worked, so he could get more insight into how to possibly control it, and then that would kind of feed it back into ideas for him of how he could try maybe different styles. That, oh, if this is the way the algorithm works, maybe it would be more advantageous to use it for screenplays and things like that rather than long form novel generation. And we found very quickly that at the current state of where the AI was, it was definitely the case that the algorithm could provide kind of moments of joy and moments of inspiration, even kind of inspire a little bit of chaos into the process that was actually helpful for maybe pushing Daniel to go in directions that he wouldn't have naturally gone in, almost like potentially like another human collaborator. But we also learned where the limitations of the algorithms were at the time, especially around kind of maintaining a coherent long-term engagement. So, as you try to write more and more text, the algorithm, engineering-wise, has a relatively short memory, you could say. Like it can't read very much into the past. It can just see a tiny little bit of what the last bit of the conversation was. So we found that it would be good for maybe giving you new ideas, but it wasn't necessarily good for writing a novel. And even to the degree that it might be counterproductive to work with it if you were writing a novel because of that. But this was great, because this is exactly what we were looking for and trying to find, okay, what should the next steps be in the nitty-gritty of the engineering if you want to build a real chair for a real human that wants to be creative and do things with these algorithms. Not just, we were at Salesforce, but this was a question about what to do with AI and what this technology, what its impact could be on language and on humans. It wasn't really about a specific product or anything like that. This was just pure research. So we were out there trying to find and identify what would be the best way for these algorithms and this technology to interface with humans. And this was a wonderful first test of that, and seeing where you could get something out of it and make Daniel laugh and write something that he wouldn't have written, and I think enjoy 8 to 10 hours or however long we spent in the office that day. Also kind of inspire the engineers that worked on it to see how directly their work could actually make humans happy, not just more productive, not just more more efficient at doing X, Y, or Z, but like actually inspire joy directly. Was a real pleasure to see, and those things continue to improve. There are much more powerful language models now, and they're going to continue getting more powerful. I don't think we got to any answers around general AI or anything in those sessions. Those are yet to come, but it was exciting, and it was a really fun step to take with you guys and with Daniel.
But we'll get there to the answers to general AI. I'm certain of it. So my God, Brian, there's so many threads to pick up on, segues into new discussions, but I'll choose a particular one that leads us back into the realm of terminology and this confusion around it, and also back into the practical realm of our job with the grid. You called yourself a humanist at some point. So, and that's interesting because this is a term that we've used in multiple occasions in very different contexts. And it's interesting that you have very particular profile as a technologist. You even have an academic background in philosophy, and that's very rare. And so at this point, I want to talk about, first of all, the shaky terminology around what we in the 21st century call humanism, and sometimes confuse also with this, what we actually mean to say is human-centered design, bringing the human back into the design process. But humanism, clearly from a philosophical or historic perspective, has a very different connotation, not always a positive one. So we're still in the finding of this, how to frame this correctly. How do we talk about putting the human back into the tech? And so one approach with the grid is clearly the matchmaking approach. Try to match technologists with artists. And we just learned from Tobias that not all technologists are open to this idea. So to us, it's really important to make the right match the right artist with the right technologists. And clearly on Valentine's Day of last year, that was accomplished and we made a perfect match. So, but that is clearly very rare. And I wonder, do you think it's a requirement for a technologist to have a background in, say, humanities or philosophy? It's something about a different understanding of reality in order to make these collaborations or partnerships possible. Do you think other technologists would be even open to this idea? And so what would be the perfect match for you in order to have some tangible results and to really, so that this relationship could be mutually beneficial?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'm biased. You know a little bit of my background. I was doing philosophy at Stanford before I found computer science, and I was going to be a philosophy major. I thought I was going to write, huge tomes that would change humanity's conception of what they are and things like that. Far before I wrote any code. I found myself reaching a point where I was very interested in meaning and language and kind of conceptual analysis, and a lot of the old debates between like the analytic kind of everything around analyticity and trying to understand those things. I came to AI because I wanted to start using some of the computational tools I was learning on the side just for fun to study some of those questions about language and meaning. I started working with Richard because he was a PhD student back then at Stanford, and he was like the person leading deep learning in natural language at the time, and that seemed to conceptually align with a lot of the more palatable philosophies of language in some sense. So yeah, I'm biased. I come at it from that distinction. So I won't say that every engineer should have or requires that to experience what I did with Daniel, for example, where I had a day that almost really contributed to making a lot of the work really meaningful and tied it into like a really, to not use the word humanist, like human-centered project. And I know that a lot of the engineers and scientists around me have had similar experiences. I think especially now that the technology is developing to a point where the question becomes less about how we do it and more what we do with it. So for many years, it's been a one-legged stool that you can't seem to really use for anything. But you're an engineer sitting there just trying to make it work at all. You're just trying to figure out, and that's kind of taking all of your attention. And there's almost a blind faith in assuming that some of the amazing applications that you maybe foresee in the future could be possible. But you don't get that immediate experience of showing a human this and seeing them smile and seeing it kind of impact their creative process. So I think it's a very special time that engineers can see that in this particular technology. I think it's probably a very special experience whenever a scientist or an engineer sees that interaction. I think it has, I think people can experience that, but because of my bias, I do think it's good. I think everybody should pop their heads up and think about big questions, and I don't think it hurts to spend a lot of your life doing that. I do. So that's my own personal bias, but I think it's good. I think it's good for us, especially for those of us working on some of these technologies, to think about how it will impact humans, not just design for humans. And I think my use of the word humanist is kind of a conceptual hodgepodge of lots of different ideas there. There's this idea of human design, like designing for humans, which I think a lot of engineers and a lot of tech in some ways or another does, because they're designing for humans in some way. And then there's kind of the other extreme of when I started out in research, doing the research, like using engineering and technology and science to study questions about humans, which isn't really designing for humans, but asking questions about humans. And there's this additional level of thinking about what it means to be human and having that be informed by our interactions with technology and with the things that we make and what we do with them. And I really have liked this direction in natural language processing and deep learning and these moments with Daniel, because it kind of gives us one anchor to explore all of those. You can be someone who's designing for humans and make an algorithm like control so that humans can control it. You can think about bias and ethics and fairness with these things and think about broader social and political impact. You can look at what they do and what they create on their own as they're getting better and reflect on what it means to be human if they write poetry that's better than you. You might just have to be okay with that question. It might make you uncomfortable for your poetry to land flat on the person next to you, like mine does, but have my algorithm's poems, inspire my coworker to start looking into poetry and start reading poetry for months and months. That's a little bit weird as a human. And I think that's good for us. I think it makes us reflect on what it means to be doing what we're doing. And I think that means we're living through like kind of a special time where we might have to, handle some of those questions and maybe even figure out, especially for those maybe not living their daily lives as artists and creatives, what it means to make meaning. And I think that's really kind of an interesting humanist or human-centered question.
Absolutely, and it's a wonderful final thought, and we are very excited about what you're going to come up with in your new endeavor together with Richard, where you can't talk about it, but I know in our preparation talks that you're really trying to solve some very, very big and fundamental questions, and that you're open to working with artists and with the grid also in your new capacity, which is very, very excited. And there's maybe another pilot project that we are in the making in the framework of the grid. Some final remarks I will leave up to Clara, but I wanted to thank all the panelists from my side for their really interesting contributions and giving us a little sneak peek into our work in the last 1.5 years and also into the projects to come. Clara?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Also from my side, you're fantastic. It's very rare to meet a human being like you, but also, of course, a project partner. So we look forward to collaborating in the future. And this is our email, contact@getonthegrid.org. Getonthegrid.org is our website. Subscribe. We have plenty of activities. Get on our map. Be visible if you're an artist, an art institution, a technologist, a philosopher, a thinker of any sort, but also just audience. So this was the grid in 6 spotlights. Thank you for joining. Thank you to all our panelists. And with that, we hand over to Caroline and Julian. And thank you for the invitation, EUNIC Global.
Thank you so much, Martin and Clara. That was incredibly interesting.
Thank you to all the members of Get on the Grid for streaming across a great distance to join us here at EUNIC DX AI. We invite all of our viewers to return here tomorrow at this same Zoom link at noon for a discussion about AI and art from the viewpoint of cultural institutes, curators, and of course, artists.
In fact, tomorrow's morning session or noon session will be followed up by an evening session at 6 p.m. CET or in California, 9 a.m. PST, featuring stream performances by artists Hexorcismos and Jena Sutella, both of whom are based in Berlin and who work with and through machine learning, lest we call it AI.
You can think of it as an early after party before our final day on the 19th, exploring AI and education with a special focus on language learning.
In a second, we are going to invite you to join us, if you want to, on a special platform that we've been experimenting with. Perhaps, Pedro, you can add that link to the chat right now. Okay, cool. So feel free to click on that. While you're checking out that space, I want to say a special thank you to Gita Schock from EUNIC, who is responsible for the concept of this program, curation and production by Jeanette Neustadt of the Goethe Institute. The technical production is by Pedro Yardim of New Kin Co. Animations and technical support by Tim Novikov. The graphic design is by Amelie Bacher and Atelier Brenda. The coordination, Lina Kiryatsoviate, I hope I get this right by the end of this week, and Giacomo Coronoggio and Robert Kieft. The moderation, I'm Caroline Busta.
Julian Wadsworth.
From newmodels.io. And thank you again to the grid and to all the participants. We hope you will now join us, if you like, on the link that Pedro has just put here, wander.me. It's an informal coffee break type space where you can speak with some of the speakers who had time today, more informally, one-on-one in a group video chat.
the coffee area if you're in the West Coast of the United States, and the bar if you're here
Exactly.
in Europe.
Exactly. All right. Well, signing off from Berlin, wishing you a good day in California. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you all here again tomorrow for EUNIC DX AI Week Day 3. Tschüss.
Tschüss.